Chapter 2 Smoke. The loss of the oceans rendered our steam and coal-powered ships quite useless. We were forced to create new methods of transportation, vessels that could fly over the void. We'd played with the idea in the past, but now it was necessary. From A World Without Light. Arthur dashed from his room, flying down the stairs and out the door. Heat stung at his face, and smoke choked his lungs. He looked out around him. Fire. Everywhere. Their neighbor houses had great holes through their walls, the wood burning and billowing dark clouds into the sky. Arthur searched for the source of the flames. He found it, looking high in the columns of smoke. Parting the fumes cruised two flying ships. The vessels were black wood, armored with dark steel, which pointed at sharp angles, as if the ship itself were feral. An insignia of a bloody fist decorated the towering sails. 6 great cannons poked from hatches on either side. Deafening blasts boomed as they fired blazing spheres of iron into the buildings below. Arthur ducked down as a cannonball blew away the roof of his home. He had to find his father. He took a second to gather his bearings, locating the direction of the town hall through all the smoke. He tucked his head down low, breathing the clean air closer to the ground. Screams cried out all around him. He spun between buildings, the air dizzying. Everything was bathed in the orange glow of fire. His head pounded. The thunderous choir of cannon fire sang above him. The smoke, it stung at his lungs, the heat upset his stomach, and he struggled to keep pushing on. He collapsed at the end of a row of homes, sliding down one's exterior, trying to catch his breath. That's when he heard a cry from inside. A child, whose voice barely carried over the roaring flames. Arthur looked around. People panicked, bloody and concussed. He saw the front door of the house was open, a trail of blood leading down the street from the doorway. Shit. They left him, Arthur coughed out, picking himself up off the ground. He moved over to the entrance, shielding his eyes from the smoke billowing from the doorway. The interior was similar to that of his own home, a small kitchen to the left, a living room to the right. But a flaming hole ripped through the living room, part of the room above collapsing down into it. The child's screams rang from the second floor. Arthur approached the stairs, but overhead a burning support beam crumbled under the weight of debris, falling between him and the steps. He blocked his face from the spray of embers, and his eyes darted around the destroyed house. The partial collapse into the living room provided a possible way up, the slope of the floor at a steep but climbable angle. The furniture from the bedroom piled at the bottom of the hole and was stable enough for Arthur to steady himself upon. He pushed himself up onto the second floor. Smoke pooled, completely clouding the upper half of the floor. Arthur crouched in through the doorway and into the hall. "Hey, buddy! Where are you?" he yelled out. "I'm here! I'm stuck!" screamed the child from behind a door at the opposite end of the hall. The tapestries over the windows smoldered in flame as Arthur ran past. He readied himself before reaching the door, angling his shoulder forward. He crashed through the wood, tumbling out onto the floor on the other side. Arthur scrambled to his feet, locking eyes with the small child. He was trapped on his bed, a toppled wardrobe pinning him down. Arthur attempted to lift the dresser. Straining his muscles, it rose an inch or so off the bed before slipping from his grip and crashing down once again. The boy let out a terrified scream, and Arthur recoiled. He searched for another option. Looking down, he saw the splintered leg of the bed. "Hold on, buddy. Get ready to move." Arthur kicked at the broken leg, breaking it even further. His leather boot cracked the wood, and the recoil shuddered up his body. But after repeated blows, the leg snapped clean off, causing the front of the bed to fall to the floor. Arthur reached out with his magic, trying to pull the wardrobe in the other direction, holding it in place. Every muscle in his body felt as if it was aflame. The kid crawled out from the ruins of the bed, and Arthur let the furniture drop. It crashed down onto the bed, completely snapping it in half. A rush of blood dizzied Arthur, causing him to stagger backward, landing on the floor. The boy latched onto Arthur. His eyes were irritated and swollen. "Where are my mom and dad?" Fear stung every word. He was no older than 8, and his left arm was heavily bruised, with a multitude of lacerations all over the left side of his body. "They're already out," Arthur grunted, climbing to his feet. "Come on." He grabbed the child's hand, leading him down the hall. They reached the hole in the bedroom. Arthur picked the kid up and knelt beside the opening. He slowly lowered him down, keeping him away from the sharp debris and fire. The kid touched down on the floor and looked up at Arthur. "Where did they go?" "I don't know, bud. Just go outside and avoid anyone you don't recognize." The kid nodded and scrambled out the door. Arthur readied himself to drop, but didn't get the chance. A cannon shot ripped through the house once more, causing the entire building to become unstable. As Arthur staggered around, the four collapsed beneath him. He lay in a pile of wooden rubble, splinters piercing his back. His whole world was reeling. The burning room spun around him. He stumbled to his feet, wincing with pain. He wheezed smoke from his lungs and shuffled out the door. Looking around, he couldn't find the boy. All he could do was pray he was all right. And Arthur's original goal returned to his mind, and the town square was not far from here. But as he started towards the meeting hall, something troubled him. The sound of cannon fire had stopped. He searched the skies. The ships remained airborne, but steel anchors locked them in place. Sleek ropes descended from their decks to the ground. Figures slid down them, the bright light of fire gleaming off metal weapons. Their silhouettes varied between small and nimble, and bulky and monstrous. Arthur ran to the town square. The hospital was all but burned to the ground, and the town hall was full of cannon holes, with the wooden supports burning a fire far larger than the others around. But he didn't care. He charged through the collapsed doorway. "Dad!" he screamed out. "Where are you?" Arthur pushed his way further into the crumbling building. The second floor had almost entirely fallen, the tapestries burnt to a crisp, the finely crafted table at the building's center in shambles. He saw limbs poking out from underneath the rubble, bloody, burnt, and motionless. But none were large enough to be his father's. He called upon his aspect and threw debris from his path. He reached the rear of the hall. Splintered support beams and fallen pieces of roof blocked an open door. Fire reflected off a blood trail along the scorched floor, which led outside. There was a large enough gap between the rubble and the floor for Arthur to crawl through. He dropped to his stomach, using his arms to pull himself forward. His breath blew the ash from the floor into his eyes. He blinked the pain away. The heat of the flames stung his exposed skin, but he pushed forward. His fingers grasped the doorframe, and he pulled himself from the crawl space. The trail continued down the street. He followed the blood. It turned down a neighboring street and stopped before a half-destroyed home. On the ground in front of the house was Arthur's father. A metal boot was planted on his chest. Towering over his father was a figure whose silhouette matched those he had seen descending the airship. He wore metal greaves, their appearance violent. Scars covered his bare chest, as well as the same bloody fist insignia branded onto his breast. The flickering of the fire made his dry yellow skin blend with the environment around him. The features of his face matched those of the orcs of the Gisk Desert, far to the south. His bulbous nose slanted down into a sharp point above his thin, cracked lips. His ears curved out as if leaning away from his face. Crude piercings jutted from his earlobes and lip. His gnarled teeth spew spit as he laughed over his victim. "Your fight was pathetic. Barely worth the sport." Mr. Pelor was drained, the color stripped from his body. His hand was mangled, his fingers crushed and burnt. He groaned, barely able to move. Arthur screamed out, yards from his father. "Get off of my dad, you bastard!" He scooped up a blazing piece of wood, tossing it through the air at the orc. As it reached the top of its arc, he forced its movement down, miming its movements and driving his hand towards the ground. The debris shot downward, doubling in momentum, enveloped in whips of purple. It pierced the uncovered chest of the attacker, whose attention shot up at Arthur. "Art! No! Run!" Panic shone through Mr. Pelor's bruised eyes. Fear clutched his words. The orc's crude smile grew larger, and he looked back down at Arthur's father. "You've a son! Seems a stronger adversary than you." He knelt down on Mr. Pelor's back, placing a serrated steel blade against his throat. "Let's see if his resolve is as strong, though. Can he fight without Daddy there to inspire?" Stop, please! Arthur cried out, breaking into a sprint towards them. The whole world then seemed to slow, as Arthur helplessly watched. With one swift motion from the orc, the blade ripped through Mr. Pelor's neck, crimson blood spraying out onto the cobbles below. No! The word ripped at his throat. Tears would fall were his eyes not choked with smoke. The instant surge of grief struck his stomach as he skid to a stop. He was dizzy. He needed to vomit, but he couldn't. The orc climbed off the corpse, licking the blade clean. Arthur's face twitched uncontrollably as he looked up at the approaching killer. He flipped through hundreds of emotions, a spiral of feelings, but he didn't have the time to filter through them all as the orc neared him. Arthur looked up. His father's killer stood before him, a snaggle-toothed smile gleaming down upon him. I was hoping someone in this shithole would be a magic twat and give me a right fight. Well, seems I've found him. The orc backed up, puffing out his chest and spreading his arms. Come on, hit me again. Arthur couldn't move. His head pounded, and he struggled to push breaths out. Oh, lost your gusto, have ya? His voice was rough and goading. Shame. The orc lunged forward with his daggers. On pure survival instinct, Arthur jumped backwards, the blades narrowly missing his chest. As panic overpowered his shock, his attention fully returned. He backstepped, retreating from his attacker. He ducked and dodged between slashes. In a vain attempt at fighting back, he tried to force the orc towards the ground, but the assailant's will was far greater than his own, and he pushed through the magical force with ease. Arthur wasn't making enough distance backstepping. He turned on his heels, making a dead sprint in the opposite direction, but he spent just too long turning, and he saw a flash of steel. His back stung with pain, but he ran off. The clanking of the orc's metal boots against the ground followed close behind. If there's no fight, a good chase can make up for it, the orc laughed out behind him. Arthur knew the streets of Merkel better than his attacker. He whipped around corners that the orc wasn't ready for, but his sheer speed allowed him to keep up. Arthur didn't know where he was going. Fear and panic drove his every step. He looked over his shoulder at his pursuer, a crucial mistake, as that his gaze fixed on the path ahead of him, his foot caught on a still body. He flew to the ground, head crashing first into the cobbles. Sliding across the cool street, he stopped before the blazing ruins of his own home. He looked back at what he'd tripped on. It was the corpse of a small boy, jaw snapped at an unnatural angle, completely parallel with the rest of his face. Both sets of teeth touched the ground, and a pool of blood surrounded it all. The orc flipped Arthur over onto his back. The killer towered over him, a jeering smile fanning ear to ear. The light of the fires around gave him a sharp backlit glow. Blood trailed down his well-defined musculature from the puncture wound in his chest. Fun chase, but still pathetic. The orc grabbed the wood lodge in his chest. You didn't manage a solid blow. He tore the debris from his breast. Let it be of solace that at least you died, having injured me. Skrask the Merciless. A feat not many can claim. Arthur searched for any last chance as Skrask raised the daggers overhead. But he knew he couldn't overpower the orc. He looked up, accepting the inevitability of his incoming demise. But that's when his eyes settled on the burning roof above him. It hung far over where it should, ready to fall at any moment. An idea, but only a moment to act upon it. Skrask had finished his gloating, ready for the kill. Arthur jerked his arm upwards, grasping at the sky. Pain soared through his body as he used his remaining strength to pull the flaming structure down. The sound of loud splintered wood drew Skrask's attention up, just in time to see the wood beams collide with his face. It pinned him to the ground, horrid screams bellowing from his throat. Arthur painfully propped himself up, slowly climbing to his feet. He looked down at his attacker, who flailed helplessly beneath the blazing rubble, covering the entire right half of his face. Clutching his head, Arthur hobbled away from the scene, the piercing screams howling behind him. Concussed and unsure of what to do, Arthur stumbled between the paths of the buildings. His entire body ached, his throat burned, his eyes stung, and his heart was heavy. He crumbled to his knees at the north edge of town. He braced himself on the ground, feeling his stomach churn and squeeze. Vomit hurled from his mouth onto the grass, blood and ash mixed with the fluids. Through bleary eyes, he looked out at the world beyond the burning Mirkel. The shapes were blurry, but he was able to make out the shining lights of Blackwater. The city. Safety. But it was miles away, and he couldn't make it there in his current state. He looked to the woods between Mirkel and Blackwater Lake. Anything's better than dead in the street. He picked himself up, limping out beyond town. He scaled a hill and turned to look at his home. The columns of smoke stretched into the dark sky above. The south side of town was nothing but scorched ruins. The blood-curdling screams of slaughter echoed from the streets, mixing with the cacophony of brutish laughter. His house, the home he was born and raised in, half destroyed and ignited in the great flame overtaking every structure. Arthur stood, overtaken with sadness, yet he could produce no tears. He couldn't move, enveloped at the sight. He was snapped from his daze by the sounds of orcish voices. At the edge of town was a group of 6 of them, all fully clad in leather armors. Half-empty quivers were slung over their enormous shoulders, and they held hefty wooden bows while they scanned the nearby area. One of them spotted him at the top of the hill. "Boys! Over here! We got a run up top!" He spoke the common tongue with the grace of a child eating rocks, but this was not reflective of his skills with the bow. His first arrow would have nearly hit Arthur had he not ducked. Arthur ran towards the woods, the orcs taking chase. The open area before the forest was hundreds of feet across, without any cover from arrow fire. As he sprinted through the field, Arthur looked over his shoulder, seeing the arrows silhouetted in the sky against the rising flames. He focused on the closest one, tapping the air. The projectile slightly changed course, just enough for it to miss Arthur completely. As the forest neared, Arthur devoted his full attention to his sprint. His feet throbbed and his lungs ached, but he ignored them. He wasn't a stranger to pushing himself. But now it was the only choice. The thud of arrows striking wood sounded in rhythm with Arthur's entrance into the woods. The scenery around rushed by in a watery blur as tears finally filled his eyes. He never looked back to see how close the orcs were. He ran and ran until his legs gave out. Arthur collapsed at the edge of a small creek, splayed out on his back. He stared at the canopy of leaves above, trying to gather his senses. Sharp, uneven breaths shook his body as pain howled its way through every muscle. The forest was painfully quiet. The only sound was the slight lapping of the creek water against the mud, and the rush of danger subsided as his thoughts returned. He saw his father's face, the wounds on his body, the terror in his eyes. He saw the splatter of blood, the cruel, joyless smile on his killer's face. Arthur's face clenched, and he let out a violent scream. Finally, able to let it out, not choked with smoke or threatened with death, tears ran down his face onto the ground beneath him. As his emotions poured out of him, they worsened. He hadn't just lost his father. He'd lost his home, everyone he knew. People who knew his name, people who he had helped, all dead. Nothing but ash and rubble. He saw the mangled face of the dead child, who only now did he realize was the one he had saved from the burning home. His mind began to twist, his despair spun into anger, his fear of the raiders warped into vindictive rage. He wanted so badly to hurt them as they had hurt him, but as he struggled to sit up, he realized he couldn't. His stew of emotions all calmed into a sinking morning. He was helpless. He couldn't fight them. All he's ever done was run. He shuffled himself over to a small overhanging bank next to the creek and crawled underneath. The cool mud chilled his hot skin as he curled into a ball. He didn't fight to keep his eyes open. Instead, let the grip of exhaustion take him.